What was the biggest bluff in history? Columbus and the 1504 eclipse. On his fourth voyage, Columbus found himself stranded in Jamaica. The locals were initially cooperative, but after a year or so got sick of Columbus' crew's Dutchbaggery and basically wanted them gone. Columbus had a star almanac with him and noticed a lunar eclipse coming up, so he called the natives together and told them that his god was mad. They had started to become so inhospitable and was going to take the moon out of the sky. Sure enough, when night came, the moon slowly turned red, and everyone begged Chris to make it stop. He said he had to go pray about the whole thing and locked himself in his cabin with an hourglass, waiting until he knew the moon would be coming out of the shadow. Came out and basically said, "Okay, God says he'll bring the moon back if you start supplying us again," which they did.
That's a pretty wild story. Columbus really played the locals to get what he wanted. Using an eclipse as a manipulation tactic shows how desperate he was. Imagine being those locals, watching the moon turn red and thinking it was all because of some foreign dude. It's both clever and kind of messed up. Just goes to show how power dynamics can shift with a little knowledge. Some real survival instincts at play there.
The capture of Fort Detroit in the War of 1812. British General Brock took the fort, 582 regulars and 1,600 militiamen. With a minimal force, 50 regulars, 250 volunteers, and 200 natives, by shelling the walls, screaming, and continuously marched their men around to make it appear as though they had a force of several thousand regulars and natives. The British continued to support this by sending a letter they knew would be intercepted by the Americans that asked for no more natives be allowed into the area, as there were already 5,000 there. All of these mind games made American General Hull believe he was facing a superior force, and he surrendered the fort to them without a fight.
It's interesting how perception can change the outcome in a conflict. General Brock used tactics that made it seem like he had a much larger force, which pushed Hull to surrender without a fight. It's a reminder that sometimes, it's not just about the numbers but how you play the game. Makes you think about how often that kind of strategy comes into play in other areas, not just war.
Operation Mincemeat was pretty neat. UK intelligence dropped a dead supposed pilot off the Spanish coast with false information that the Allies were going to invade Greece, not Sicily. So convinced were the Nazis that, when the Allies actually invaded Sicily, it was quickly overcome and served as a launching pad for the liberation of Greece.
Yeah, Operation Mincemeat is an interesting piece of history. Using a fake body to mislead the enemy is clever. It's wild how something so simple can change the course of a war. The Nazis biting on that was a big win for the Allies. It shows how intelligence and deception can play crucial roles in military strategy. Sometimes, playing the long game pays off in unexpected ways.
One particular time, in the Great Siege of Malta, around 4,000 Ottomans were going to charge our old, poorly fortified city of Medina. All the people living in Medina at the time, around 200, went up on the walls with around 40 knights and other mercenaries and formed a line. They got with them a statue of St. Mary and started praying. The Ottomans got scared when they saw a file of people on the walls, as they thought the city was heavily fortified. They could not see that half of those people were peasants, children, and women because of the sun shining on the wall from the back, so they retreated. Maltese people considered the event a miracle by St. Mary, because if the Ottomans didn't retreat, they would all have been killed. It's an unknowing bluff, but was one vital turning point amongst many other ones in the victory against the Ottomans and the halting of their invasion across the Mediterranean in 1560s.
That's an interesting tale. It's crazy to think how appearances played a crucial role in changing the course of events. A small group, really just a mix of people and a statue, managed to create such a strong impression. The Ottomans probably thought they were facing a well-defended stronghold. In a way, it's a reminder that sometimes perception can outweigh reality, especially in moments of crisis.
During the opening years of the Japanese Sengoku Jidai, a small clan, the Matsudaira, offered themselves as vassals to the more powerful Imagawa clan for protection. The deal requires the Matsudaira heir to live as a hostage of the Imagawa, but their mutual enemy, the Oda, kidnap him and threaten to kill the boy unless the two clans end their alliance. The lord of the Matsudaira's response was, "Do it." He said that if the Oda killed his son, he would still remain allied to the Imagawa. Losing his only heir would prove to his new allies how committed he was toward them. The Oda believed him and sit on the boy for a few years until he is finally rescued and ends up living a long and prosperous life under his more well-known name, Tokugawa Ieyasu.
It's interesting how loyalty can take such extreme forms. There was this clan, Matsudaira, that committed to their alliance with the Imagawa. They even sent their heir as a hostage. When the Oda kidnapped him, the Matsudaira lord chose to stand firm and let them do what they wanted. That decision showed his loyalty, and in the end, the boy they threatened grew up to be Tokugawa Ieyasu. It's a heavy price for honor, for sure.
Maybe I missed it, but I'm partial to Gen H, Norman Schwarzkopf's deception of the Iraqi military during Operation Desert Storm. Essentially, the U.S. intelligence community had reason to believe top Iraqi leadership watched CNN and took it as gospel. The U.S. set up a large amphibious landing demonstration, which they let press attend. Iraqi leadership saw this as CNN presented. They understood this as a rehearsal for the coalition's plan. To cement the thought process, the U.S. dropped leaflets depicting death from the sea. Saddam then reorganized his troops along the coast for the inevitable attack. This allowed for the left hook from Saudi Arabia, causing the destruction of the third biggest military in the world in a matter of days.
It's interesting how information can be used as a weapon. I remember a friend who worked in intelligence. He used to say how easy it is to mislead with just a few well-placed messages. Sometimes the simplest strategies can lead to huge outcomes. That whole operation changed the course of things without needing to fire a shot. Just a clever use of perception and the right timing. Crazy how that works.
1775, just outside Boston. Washington takes high ground known as Dorchester Heights and fortifies it. Benedict Arnold had just captured the Fort Ticonderoga and its large supply of cannons. Over horrible terrain, the Continental Army was able to get these cannons to Washington. Unfortunately, Washington had neither the powder nor the shot to actually do much with his cannons. It didn't matter. The British commander of Boston didn't want to risk losing his ships to the cannons, and didn't want a repeat of Bunker Hill. So he retreated.
It's interesting how sometimes the threat of power is enough to change the game. Washington managed to shift the balance without even firing a shot. Just goes to show that strategy and positioning can be more effective than just brute force. Arnold's efforts played a crucial role in that shift too, despite the challenges. It's like a tactical chess match where the opponent decided to concede rather than face the risk.
The Ghost Army used by the U.S. Army in World War II. Basically, they used inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and fake radio transmissions to stage more than 20 battlefield deceptions, often operating very close to the front lines. They used inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and airplanes that the men would inflate with air compressors, and then camouflage imperfectly so that enemy air reconnaissance could see them. They could create dummy airfields, troop bivouacs, complete with fake laundry hanging out on clotheslines, motor pools, artillery batteries, and tank formations in a few hours. Many of the men in this unit were artists, recruited from New York and Philadelphia art schools.
That's an interesting part of World War II history. They really got creative with their tactics. Using inflatable tanks and fake sounds to trick the enemy is something you don't hear about often. It's cool that they brought an artist for this. Kind of shows how diverse skills can come together for a common goal. It must have been quite the sight to see those fake setups, knowing it was all for deception.
I remember hearing a story once in history class about a medieval ruler whose castle was under siege. The siege had been going on for a long time, and they were just about out of food and would have had to surrender. They had one cow left alive, and they decided to do the one thing that may break the siege. They catapulted the cow over the wall. Then, they stood on the top of the wall yelling, "We have so much food, we can throw cows over the walls." The enemy was so demoralized that they left, and that's how that castle survived the siege.
That's an interesting story. It's wild how that medieval ruler used a cow to scare off the enemy. Just goes to show that sometimes the craziest ideas can work. It's also a reminder that desperation can lead to unexpected tactics. I mean, who would have thought a cow could be such a game changer in a siege? That level of confidence in that moment was something else.
Did anyone mention Vlad Dracula? Despite only having a relatively small army, by using psychological warfare, he was able to fend off or avoid war with the Ottoman Empire. Edit. I say psychological warfare because even though he did defeat some enemies, he bluffed the Ottoman Empire by lining a field with spiked enemies, making it appear that Vlad was more dangerous than he actually was, when in fact he was greatly outnumbered, and if the Ottomans weren't so thrown off by the display, they probably would have wiped Vlad and his people off.
It's interesting how fear can be a powerful tool. I remember a friend who got backed into a corner during a debate. Instead of just arguing facts, he started telling stories that made his point seem more dramatic. It wasn't about winning the argument but making the other side hesitant. Sometimes, that kind of strategy can really change the outcome of a situation, even if the numbers aren't in your favor.
Certainly not the biggest in history, or the biggest in anything for that matter, but an interesting bit of trivia and history that most people don't know. Newburgh, Indiana, a little town right on the Ohio River in southwestern Indiana, was the only first town north of the Mason-Dixon line to be captured by the Confederates during the Civil War. The small group of raiding Confederate soldiers crossed the river from Kentucky and carried stovepipes to look like cannons, and it worked. They occupied the town for a couple hours. If I remember correctly, it's been years since I read the details. No shots were fired, no loss of life, but I believe they did take some supplies.
That's an interesting piece of history. It's wild to think how a small group could just waltz in and take over a town with fake cannons. It shows how much perception can matter in a conflict. Just a few hours of occupation, and it didn't even lead to violence. The fact that they were able to pull it off with simple tricks is a reminder of the tactics people can use in desperate times.
Genghis Khan did a good bluff. Under the siege of a Chinese fortress, he announced that he would end his siege in exchange for a gift of 1,000 cats and 10,000 swallows. The fortress commander gratefully complied. After the animals arrived in the Mongol camp, Genghis Khan ordered his men to tie a small cotton wool tuft to the tail of each creature, then set the tuft afire. When the panicked and frightened animals were turned loose, they made directly for their nests and lairs and igniting hundreds of small fires. While the defenders were preoccupied with putting out fires, Genghis Khan's warriors stormed the city in conquest.
Genghis Khan's bluff was clever. He knew how to manipulate fear. By using the cats and swallows, he created chaos and distraction. The fortress was so focused on the fires that they didn't see the attack coming. It's interesting how sometimes a simple trick can change the outcome of a situation. This story shows the importance of strategy in any conflict, whether on the battlefield or in everyday life.
My grandma used to work for IBM as a programmer. She told me this story once. There was a project commissioned to them by the Corps of Engineers to write a program that would check the water levels, flow rate, and similar pieces of information from all of the dams on the Columbia River. The best programmer my grandma knew was the lead on the project, and when it was finished, the Corps of Engineers said it was no good, that the program ran too fast, and there was no way the data could be accurate. So my grandma said that this programmer just put a bunch of for loops in the code to make it run quite a bit slower. Then gave it back and the Corps of Engineers said it was perfect. Every few years they would be asked to revise the code to see if they could make it faster, and this guy would just reduce the number of iterations on each loop.
That's a solid story. It's interesting how sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. Your grandma sounds like a smart person, knowing how to navigate that situation. The lead programmer's trick with the loops is a classic example of working the system. It's kind of funny how the engineers thought slower was better, but I guess in that case, they just wanted reliable data.
User Turboard referred to the photo reconnaissance dummy armies of WW2. One of two things I came here to mention. The other is the Pas-de-Calais invasion. Allied forces took advantage of the temporary disgrace of General George S. Patton after an incident in his camp to send him on observation missions and tours that were deliberately not secret enough. German intelligence believed, as was intended, that a genuinely talented general would not be excluded from the invasion plans, and as such the Normandy landings were a distraction. They concentrated their forces way north of the invasion that was in progress, awaiting a second landing by a ghost army that would never come. This probably saved tens of thousands of lives on both sides and equal numbers of French civilians by reducing the scale of the initial conflicts.
It's interesting how deception played such a big role in the outcome of WW2. I remember a friend telling me about tactics like that. He was really into military history and would spend hours explaining how these strategies could change the course of battles. The way they misled the Germans to save lives is something you rarely hear about. It's a reminder of how complicated warfare can be, beyond just the fighting itself.
Napoleon marching into Austria, his men couldn't get across a bridge. So he had his officers cross the bridge laughing and joking, and had them tell the Austria army on the other side that a treaty had been signed. The Austrians believed them due to a lack of communication and allowed the army to cross. Napoleon's army then encircled and captured the Austrians' army. I'm not sure of all of these details, but feel free to research and correct my mistakes. It's what I remember from AP European history.
It's interesting how a simple trick can change the course of an event. Napoleon's strategy to use deception shows how effective communication can be. His officers playing that role really turned the situation around. It's wild to think about how a bit of laughter created such a serious victory. Makes you wonder about the power of psychology in warfare. Definitely something you don't see every day.
This sounds incredibly exaggerated if it happened at all. Maybe if a lunar eclipse happened once every 100 years, and it just so happened to fall at the perfect time for Columbus. But they're nowhere near that rare. So the idea that this was something so unusual to the natives that they believed Columbus had magically done it is a bit far-fetched. I mean, the timing I'm sure would have had some people believing, but I can't believe no one was like, hey, we've seen this before, maybe it's a coincidence. Or something.
Yeah, it does sound pretty far-fetched. It's hard to think that nobody in the native community would have recognized a lunar eclipse. People generally keep track of such things. It's almost like they just wanted to make Columbus seem more mysterious or powerful. It's funny how history gets twisted sometimes, focusing on the dramatic parts instead of the simple truths.
This is also a Croatian folktale. The story goes that the Turks were surprised by the resistance when they tried to conquer the fort of Đurđevac, and their leader, Ulema Beg, opted for a long-term sieging tactic to starve out the defenders. After a while, food really did run out in the fort, except for a single chicken that was hidden by an old lady. When it was discovered, the defenders obviously wanted to eat it, but the old lady convinced their leader to instead put it in a cannon and fire it at the surrounding Turks. Dismayed that the Croats had enough food to fuck around like that, they left, cursing the Croats for chickens.
That's an interesting tale. It shows how creativity can turn a tough situation around. The old lady's idea was unexpected but smart, using the last bit of food to send a message instead of just eating it. It's wild to think that a chicken could help scare off an entire army, all while making them feel foolish. Definitely one way to defend your home without direct confrontation.
Sorry, I don't mean to argue here, but what is this supposed to achieve? Are they banking on the besieger thinking, whoops, they still have food? Let's go home. Edit. Thanks for the answers, people. I forgot that the attrition goes both ways, and the besiegers are running on scarcity as much as the town/castle residents are.
It's true that both sides face tough situations in a siege. My buddy once told me about a time he got caught in a dilemma during a game. He thought he could outlast his opponent by holding on to resources, but soon realized they were both in a race against time. Sometimes, it's not just about defense, but also figuring out how to outsmart the other side while in the same boat.
Brock had his troops walk down a road, visible from the fort, and once out of sight, they'd hop down into a ditch and crouch so as not to be seen, run back to the start, and walk the road again. They'd do this for hours, making their troops' size look near hundredfold its size. They also convinced the natives to split their night fires up into groups of 2 to 4, knowing that Hull knew the natives usually maintained fires of 20 or more. So instead of having the 200 natives maintain 10 fires, there were upwards of 100 fires, making the native force appear to approach 2,000.
This reminds me of a time when a friend of mine used smoke and mirrors during a paintball game. He set up fake markers to confuse the other team. We ended up looking way more numerous than we really were. It played with their heads, and we got the upper hand. It was a simple trick, but it really turned the tide for us. Sometimes, less is more in strategy.
Tokugawa Ieyasu, Duchon, Jakong, January 31st, 1543 to June 1st, 1616, was the founder and first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, which virtually ruled Japan from the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Ieyasu seized power in 1600, received appointment as shogun in 1603, abdicated from office in 1605, but remained in power until his death in 1616. His given name is sometimes spelled Ieyasu, 2 according to the historical pronunciation of he. Ieyasu was posthumously enshrined at Nikko Tashogu with the name Tasho Daegongen. Dongjal Da Chen Shan?
Tokugawa Ieyasu's story is pretty interesting. He played a huge role in shaping Japan's history. After the Battle of Sekigahara, he took charge and set up the Tokugawa shogunate. Even though he stepped down as shogun, he still called the shots. Died in 1616, but his legacy is felt even today, especially with that shrine at Nikko. Just shows how one person can really change things.
I love reading about McClellan because he's not the worst guy in history by any stretch of the imagination, and yet he's the only guy I've read about where you can always tell that the historian writing about him is a little pissed off. It's hilarious. Historians are objective in nature. They can write about the atrocities of Hitler as a matter of fact, but with McClellan there's always just a little hint of, and then there's this fucking guy.
It's interesting how some historical figures get this kind of vibe from historians. McClellan seems to be the guy who just doesn't get the same leniency. It's like there's an unspoken frustration with how he handled things. You'd think objectivity would apply to everyone, but his case is a reminder that personal feelings can seep in, even with the most serious subjects. Quite the character in history.
You could also point out the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was a supposed plan to design lasers that could shoot down nuclear missiles from space. It was a very preposterous plan, but that was the point. The US intended it as a bluff to make the Soviets want to accomplish the technology before the US did. In effect, the Soviet Union wasted a lot of time and resources, which only quickened their collapse.
That's an interesting take on Cold War strategies. It kind of reminds me of a friend who used to bluff in games. He'd act all confident about a terrible hand, and somehow, people would fold. It never made sense, but it worked. I guess sometimes, feigning strength can throw others off their game. Just keeping the pressure up while really not having much to back it up.
It was a town, not a castle, I believe. Zhuge Liang ordered all the gates to be opened and instructed soldiers disguised as civilians to sweep the roads while he sat on the viewing platform above the gates with two boys flanking him. He put on a calm and composed image by playing his guqin. When the Wei army led by Sima arrived, Sima was surprised by the scene before him, and he ordered a retreat after suspecting that there was an ambush inside the city. Zhuge Liang later explained that his strategy was a risky one. It worked because Zhuge Liang had a reputation for being a careful military tactician who hardly took risks. So Sima, he came to the conclusion that there was an ambush upon seeing Zhuge's relaxed composure.
Zhuge Liang's move was pretty clever. By projecting calmness and using a simple tactic, he made the enemy second-guess themselves. It's interesting how appearances can shift perceptions in battle. Sometimes, acting relaxed can be the best strategy, especially when everyone expects you to be tense. It's all about that psychological edge. Makes you think about how much confidence can influence decisions in tough situations.
I was in high school with Tim Patterson, the author of DOS. He was the smartest guy I knew. When he sold DOS to Gates, he retained the right to use DOS on computers he manufactured. A few years later, he hooked up with some Koreans and was about to flood the market with PCs that were cheaper because there was no OS fee to pay MS. Before they sold any computers, MS bought him out and gave him a job. Just having a job at MS at Microsoft during the 90s means millions in stock options without the extra dollar they gave him to buy out the license. I started working at MS in 97, and at the first internal developers conference I attended, I noticed him sitting in front of me. And during a break, we talked about high school and also what had happened with the development of DOS and the sale to MS. The thing I remember about it is that before we talked, he did not pay much attention to the speakers. He was too busy reading the Wall Street Journal. I can tell you it does not suck to be the guy who sold DOS to Microsoft. He's likely on Reddit. Maybe he can be convinced to do an AMA.
It's interesting how paths cross. I had a friend in college who was super into coding. He ended up working at a big tech company too. We used to chat about old software and where it all started. Even at school, he was always reading up on tech news. It's kind of wild thinking how these moments connect to larger stories in the industry. Makes you wonder where everyone ends up.
Yeah, I agree. Everyone laughed at the idea of the Zune Music Pass, where you would subscribe to listen to music and not own it back in 2006. That is just stupid. It's not like 9 years later the idea of paid music subscriptions hasn't caught on at all, unless you count Spotify, Google Play Music, Apple Music, Rhapsody, Radio, Amazon, Sony, and even Tidal. I know you were just trying to attack low-hanging fruit without much thought. The Zune had its issues. Being a shitty product wasn't one of them.
It's interesting how people viewed the Zune back then. Everyone saw it as a failed idea, yet now we have so many music subscription services. I remember having a friend who swore by his Zune, loved the interface. We'd have debates about it. Looking back, it's funny how trends change. What was once mocked, like paid subscriptions, became the norm. Makes you think about how we judge things too quickly.
To be honest, the Zune was a really great product. No finicky scroll to go up and scroll the other way to go down. Menus scrolled intuitively. Software was pretty damn good, and UI was great. They also had built an FM radio and video playback on the first generation. And the thing was built like a tank. I still use my first Gen 1 when I go to festivals and Burning Man, because I know it'll survive without an extra scratch on it. The only real problem was that they came in so late in the game that everyone already had brand blindness. No one wanted anything but iPods. And when the launch wasn't an incredible success, they never leaned in on the marketing as much as they should have. Personally, I love my Zune. It was a shame nothing ever came of it.
I remember my friend had a Zune. He was really into it. We used to take it to road trips and played music while driving. It had a strong build, not like the phones we have today. People would tease him for not having an iPod, but he didn't care. It was reliable, and the sound quality was good. I think it stuck with him more for the memories than anything else.
He might also have got it via a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court or the incredibly popular King Solomon's Mines, both of which came out decades before Prisoners of the Sun. As an aside, Prisoners of the Sun really cemented my opinion that Tintin is a total dick. He knows he's got a way to save them, but is happy to let Captain Haddock believe for weeks that they're headed for certain, agonizing death. And he acts all smug and laid back when the captain tries, and fails, to escape. Seriously, just tell him, "You smug little shit."
I get what you're saying. Tintin can really come off as inconsiderate sometimes. It's like he's got this I'm in control vibe, which can be annoying, especially when someone is panicking. I think we all have that one friend who just keeps things to themselves even when you clearly need the info. It's frustrating when they just go along, acting cool about it. Just say what's up, man.
Disclaimer: I'm not a historian. I cannot back the following up with direct sources. I have picked it up from different documentaries and lectures that I do not have readily available. It might also only apply to medieval Europe, but would make sense for other time periods as well. Sieges used to be extremely costly for the besiegers as well. Due to the lack of efficient infrastructure, it was difficult to feed your army. Most of the time, armies would eat what they could raid from the civilians, but if you're in the same place for an extended period of time, the civilians will pretty quickly run out of food to be taken and slash, or just leave, leaving the besiegers without a reliable source of food. Disease and raiding of the siege camps would also take a toll on the morale of the army. If it seems that the fort or city they are trying to just isn't worth it, when it actually would be, the besiegers might move on to what they believe will be easier pickings.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember a history class where we discussed how tough sieges were for both sides. We focused a lot on the logistics, and how armies had to plan carefully to keep fed. It's wild to think about how quickly things could go south not just for the defenders, but also for the attackers. Morale can really make or break a situation, especially when there's not enough food.
I always loved how the British bluffed their way out of everything during World War II. In the documentary I saw, they said that the guy in charge of making the city disappear used to radio HQ when the plane showed up, saying things like, "Here they come again, let's see if they hit anything today," without encrypting it just to piss them off.
It's pretty interesting how some people can keep their cool under pressure. I remember a friend who was always making jokes during tough times. One time, we were in a serious situation, and he just kept making light comments. It helped everyone stay calm. It's funny how humor can be a tool to deal with stress, just like that guy in the documentary.
The V2 was also just pretty worthless in general as a weapon of war. The Germans stockpiled hundreds of them and launched them all at Antwerp at the same time to try to wreak havoc the Allied supply lines, and the result was, well, basically nothing. I mean, it killed civilians and was useful as a terror weapon, but otherwise it didn't accomplish anything. Keep in mind the V1 and V2 rocket programs together cost the Germans more than the US spent on developing and producing the atomic bomb. That is how much of an investment the Germans put into the V programs, whose ultimate result was the US landing on the moon.
It's interesting how much effort went into those rockets, yet they didn't really do much in terms of military strategy. I guess it reminds me of a friend who invested a ton of time building a complicated gadget that ended up being pretty useless. He was proud of it, but in the end, it just took up space. Sometimes, all that effort doesn't really pay off, you know?
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.